want to talk about education. I know that's a topic close to you. On your campaign page, you mentioned you support school choice. While this gives avenues for parents to choose among different schooling options like private and charter schools, it doesn't address how to improve the current system. As a former educator yourself, as a current educator yourself, what are some ways we can improve our public education system for all students?
Great question. So I think a few things that I would want to comment on in relation to the education system is that in the end, we need to make sure that education is ultimately about the student. And I think with all the different things going on in education, sometimes that can get lost. And one of the things that I commonly tell my teachers in my music school is I often end our meetings and I say, thank you for all that you do for the kids. And the reason I end with that statement is because it's about them. It's about those kids. Of course, we're teachers. We need to be taken care of as well. But we need to make sure we're pinpointing and making sure our focus is very clear that it's about the kids. And so right now, I think the best thing for kids is to make sure that the money that is for education is following the student, so the parent can make the most informed decision about what's best for them and what's best for their child, so that their child can go ahead and go to the school that makes the most sense for them. And so that's something I'm a big believer in. In addition to that is that right now, again, when it comes to the public school system, we just need to make sure that there are not competing interests that are taking away from focus on the child. And so, we know that there are some school systems that might spend $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 on average to go ahead and invest in a child, and that child is doing well in that school system. Whereas, for instance, we have the Chicago public school system, where I believe they spend somewhere in the vicinity, somewhere around $30,000 per child, but yet the Chicago public school system is really struggling to serve their students well. And it's because of those competing interests that come in to try to focus on themselves rather than the kids. And my big philosophical point is, let's just make it about the kids.
So you said you want to track that money that goes with the kids, right? And make sure it's coming back to them. Correct?
Yeah, and so there are limitations of what I can do federally, because most of the money that comes in for education for a child is actually going to be at the state and at the local level. The minority of it is going to be from the federal level. But from a philosophical perspective, I believe we need to make it about the kids, making sure that state and local principalities are doing a better job at making sure that competing interests aren't getting in the way of what's best for the child and their education. And when it comes to federal tax dollars, I believe that money should be able to follow the student wherever that student goes, so that the parent has the final say in what's best for their child.
Right. Well, Mr. Evans, you still are a music teacher, and you were for many years. How can our government support the arts in schools when sometimes schools have to dedicate their budget to other priorities? Sometimes arts kind of falls to the bottom of the list.
And it's so disappointing whenever a school has to even make the decision of, do we cut arts or do we cut math or cut science? That's such a sad position. I'm so sorry for every administrator, for any school that's ever even had to broach that conversation and that decision, because that's so difficult for them to have to think about. And I think what I would tell you is that, again, we have to prioritize the arts, because if you look at what arts training does, or what musical training does, we find that the arts actually increase IQ, it increases test scores, it increases grades, it helps keep students away from substance abuse, it helps keep students in a better mental state so they're not dealing with depression or loneliness or all these other things. So we need to focus on keeping that arts training in our schools. The educational benefits in math, science, reading, and every other area are beyond tremendous. But also, I think it comes back to what we talked about a moment ago, which is we need to make sure that we're focusing on the kid and not allowing competing interests or special interests to take away that funding or take away that focus from what's best for the child.
So would you say this needs more funding from the federal government?
I think we'd have to look at it by a case-by-case situation. For me, I would just want to make sure that when it comes to federal funding for students, when it comes to arts education, that needs to be robust. And I know that every state and every principality is in a different place, but I really do believe that from a philosophical perspective, it's got to be robust, it's got to remain there. And then we need to make sure that state and local principalities are not allowing special interests to take away from the child.
Mr. Evans, you mentioned special interests not interfering with the kid. What do you mean by special interests? Are you talking about other districts? Are you talking about other states of government? What are those acting interests that can work against what, at the end of the day, what kids want?
Yeah, great question. I think one example, or one general example, is when it comes to federal tax dollars, sometimes there are there are specific educational interests or ideologies, or for instance, there are certain, let's say, people might call them woke ideologies that would try to come in and start talking about sex issues with young kids at a younger age, and then tie federal funding to specific things. And that's something that we don't need. Instead, kids should be focused on math, reading, science, and focus on the basics of education. We shouldn't be tying federal funding to some sort of different interests, whether it be some sort of some sort of sexual curriculum or anything else like that. That's just one example. I'm sure there are more of those, but again, let's just make sure we keep it simple. Let parents focus on what's best for their kid, focus on math, reading, science, and developing people to be successful, as well as also developing them to be strong when it comes to workforce training. So that for those people who know that their best path is not college, but instead some sort of trade, let's go ahead and help them get trained in that during the high school years. So that when they graduate high school, they don't have to accumulate more debt. They can go straight into the workforce, getting a good paying job, buy a home, and start a family.